Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to our political economy course. Again, I'm very happy to be your instructor. My name is Dr. Gabe Telleria. I hope you had an opportunity to see my introductory video. And again, I'm very happy and thrilled to be your instructor. And I hope that you will find this course enjoyable and also very informative. Okay, so let's get started with our week one material. So for this week, of course, it's week one, so let's go through some administrative stuff. First, we have. I want to make sure that everybody has the right textbook. Our textbook for this course, this being the political science undergraduate course, we're using the Economic Literacy Basic Economics with an Attitude book by Dr. Weaver. Okay, so that's the Weaver textbook that we're going to be using for this course. All right, and what I will do for my lectures is rather than just regurgitate everything that is on the chapters, what I will try to do is I will try to format my lectures in the following manner. I will introduce the assignments, what we have due for this week, kind of explain the expectations for the assignment and what the assignment entails, or assignments, right? And then I will also give you an overview of some of the key concepts and theories, or kind of a review, quick review of some of the key concepts and theories that you will find in the week's readings. But of course, this lecture does not supplement or does not replace, I should say, your reading of the material, because the book goes into much more detail and covers a lot more than we will cover in these lectures. I just don't want a lecture for 2 hours to bore you, right? So I want to keep this sweet and short, but of course give you some insight as to some of these key topics that we're going to be discussing. All right, so week one is again an introduction to economics, and it's an introduction to microeconomics and the theory of markets. Okay, so for week one, that's what we're going to be looking at. Again, you are to read chapter 1 in the Weaver textbook. Also, please read the handout, What is a Christian Vision for Economic Life? This is very important, especially for us here at Cal Baptist. And it's also a nice read. It gives you some intuitive perspective on what it means to be an economist with a Christian worldview, with a Christian perspective, or how does Christianity and economics kind of go hand in hand. All right, so that's a nice little handout to read. And then, of course, you have my lecture, Dr. T's PowerPoint lecture, and this is kind of an introduction to political economy, as that's what we're going to be doing today. And then you have, of course, your written assignment number 1. You are also to submit the research topic for your critical assignment, which will be due in week 8. And then you have a week 1 journal entry for this week, and then of course you have a quiz also due for this week. So you have a number of assignments that are going to be required of you for this week. If you have any questions, if you have any concerns, please feel free to reach out to me anytime via email, or also I'm going to be providing my number so that we can set up a WhatsApp chat group where we can communicate more efficiently, and I can reply quicker to your questions if you have some. All right, so let's get started then on some of these topics. So chapter 1 introduces, right, economics, principles of economics. Economics has been studied for the last 150 years, studied in two different, or through two different lenses, microeconomics and macroeconomics, right? But it wasn't always that the case, because economics has evolved through the last 150 years or 200 years, from something that was not really known and obscure to an actual science. Some even call it an art. Okay, so let's look at some of the key theorists that we're going to be discussing in this chapter, and that the chapter discusses very detailed. Some of these individuals and their contributions to economic theory and to the economic discipline. So you have, of course, we're going to be looking at Adam Smith. Adam Smith is considered the father of modern economics. His many contributions, but the most significant are his book, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, the Invisible Hand concept, also, which we'll talk about briefly. Then you have the great British economist David Ricardo. David Ricardo is considered one of the great classical economists of all time, and among his contributions, his idea of comparative advantage was significant. We'll talk about him here in a minute. Then you have Thomas Malthus. Malthus had many unique ideas. One of them was that population would outrun production. So he believed that production, no matter how efficient we would be as producers of goods and services, that population was going to increase at a much faster rate. Jean-Baptiste Say is responsible for the famous Say's law, which says that supply creates its own demand. We'll talk about that also in a bit here. And then Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, who came to be known as utilitarians, or they're the ones that really began the utilitarianism or the utility school, where you began to see things like behavior and preferences and desires, and how we could make sense of those in economic theory. So these are the classical theorists in economics that kind of set the stage for modern economics as we know it today. So again, the book goes into detail. I just want to provide these names and for each of these, some of the key elements or key concepts and contributions that these individuals have had on economic theory. It is up to you to go into more depth and review, read the book, review these concepts and theories, and if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. But just very quickly here, Adam Smith, of course, known as the father of modern economics, his great book, his great contribution is An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, or commonly known as The Wealth of Nations. This was the first comprehensive and systematic theory of an economy. It really gave us our first economic textbook in many ways. Okay, Adam Smith opposed mercantilism. Mercantilism was this idea that countries and empires would get richer by exporting and not importing anything, and so Adam Smith believed that it was not through mercantilism that nations became wealthy, but rather through the pursuit of interests, of private interests and self-interest, and in diversification and in doing what you do best and focusing on that, right? And having others who do other things better, buying from them those things, those goods and services. Okay, so of course the invisible hand is that very famous concept that Adam Smith proposed, the idea that the free markets allow these forces come together, supply and demand come together and meet in equilibrium, right, via this invisible hand that gets buyers and sellers together and gets them to agree on a price and quantity through this invisible hand concept. So that was Adam Smith. Then we have a great David Ricardo, right? David Ricardo was a member of British Parliament. He provided an analytic approach to economics. Okay, he began to look at economics much more scientifically. He was a friend of Malthus, John Stuart Mill, and John Baptiste Say. So these guys were all kind of living around the same time, and that's why they are. This is considered the great classical economists, right? Because they all kind of were coming up with different theories and different explanations about economic phenomena. He authored The Principles of Political Economy and Taxation, which was a very significant book. Among his contributions, you can look at rent theory, okay, the value of what he considered the value of land as driving the rent, right? The real value of rent was based on the value of land. Theory of comparative advantage, very important theory, especially for trade and international economics. Of course, free trade, right? He opposed the Corn Laws, which restricted imports on wheat, for example. And then law of diminishing marginal returns, which is a law that says that the more you produce, the less every time as you increase the production or the consumption of something, the returns of that extra unit, that additional unit, tend to diminish. Okay, so that's an important concept in economics. So that's the great David Ricardo. Then we have Thomas Malthus. Okay, kind of a funny name here, right? We refer to Malthusian, right? Malthusian economics. He was a close friend of Ricardo. He was a professor of economics, and he was very interested in population growth. He's one of those first individuals to really look at population growth and its influence in economic behavior and in production and in supply and demand, etc. And his big contribution, or one of his big contributions, is this idea that human beings could not produce fast enough to meet population needs, right? He believed that as population increases, okay, that's going to increase the demand for food. But because we cannot produce food fast enough, what that will lead to is misery. So he kind of had these kind of interesting, for lack of a better word, thoughts about population, and in the sense that it's almost kind of weird and eerie that he believed that the more greater increases in population would lead to misery. It would lead to not a good situation for the economy. So you had to control population because we couldn't produce food fast enough. So that was Malthus. Then we have, continue on with Malthus. He suggested, right, these checks on population growth, okay? For example, he believed in disease and famine and war, that these were the checks on population that needed to exist in order for population to not grow at such a rate that it would cause widespread misery. Okay, but he basically his contributions are based on the relationship between wages and population, because as he saw it, the more people are, the greater the population, the more people are born, the higher or the greater the labor supply, the number of workers. And as the number of workers increased, wages would fall, okay? Which meant then that if population was restricted, okay, that would reduce the labor supply and wages would rise. So there was kind of this this odd relationship that he thought about between wages and population. And so his ideas were at the time controversial, because it almost seemed like he was trying to promote checks on population to keep wages up and to not allow wages to come down as he was proposing. Okay, so now we go to Jean-Baptiste Say. Jean-Baptiste Say is responsible for the famous Say's Law. And Say's Law is kind of cool. It's kind of neat. Um, if you have seen the movie by any, and I mentioned the movie because it just came back to being in the news because of there was a baseball game played in Iowa, and they called it the Field of Dreams Classic, played in Iowa, where the movie Field of Dreams, and most of you were not even born when the movie came out, but the movie Field of Dreams was a great movie in the 1980s. Very emotional, inspirational, really cool movie. I recommend you watch it. It's a baseball movie, but it's more than baseball. It's about life, and it's about relationships with a father and a son. So it's a really nice movie. But in the movie, there's this underlying theme, underlying idea that is kind of at the essence of the movie, and this is the idea that here was this gentleman, this guy, this farmer, who was losing his farm because the crops had been bad. He could not make the bank payments, and one thing leads to another, and he begins to hear this voice telling him in his head, "If you build it, they will come." Okay, if you build it, they will come. And the voice was kind of referring to the field. If you build the field in the middle of a corn field in Iowa, that people would come, and people would come and pay money to see the field. And of course, that would result in him being able to make enough money, enough revenue to pay the bank loan. But what the unique idea here is that it actually illustrates Say's Law, because Say's Law says that supply creates its own demand. That's really what Say's Law says. And so in this idea, what the voice was telling him was, if you create this field, if you supply this experience, you're going to create the demand, and people will come. And so that's a unique perspective. And it's a unique theory, because most of the time when we think about what supply and demand, we think that demand creates supply. We think that when people demand something, the suppliers in the economy will begin to supply those goods and services that are on demand. But it's not often that we hear that supply creates its own demand. But in fact, if you think about your own in your own lives and in your daily routines, think about how many times you have seen something that you had no idea existed, and you saw it, and all of a sudden you wanted it. That's supply creating its own demand. It's because it's there, and because it's available, and because it's desirable, you want to obtain it. So that was a really, really groundbreaking idea that Jean-Baptiste Say had, 150 years ago. Very, very insightful, very intuitive law. So we continue to look at to take Say's Law today, and it's actually a very, very common occurrence in economics. So that's Say's Law. Then we have Jeremy Bentham, and Bentham is important because Jeremy Bentham begins to develop the idea of utility. And in economics, we're going to be talking about the concept of utility. And by the way, utility has nothing to do with something being useful. It has all to do with desire or how much you enjoy something, what benefit, what satisfaction you get from, say, a hamburger or a slice of pizza or new car or a new house. So utility is equals or is synonymous with satisfaction, and so it has nothing to do with usefulness. But so this idea of utility was begun by Jeremy Bentham. Okay, the thing about though Bentham, that his idea was that utility and utilitarianism were kind of joined together. In the idea that utilitarianism is based on the concept of the greatest happiness for the greatest number, the greatest good for the greater number, or the greatest numbers. That those who were, say, the majority should be the ones to decide what was right and wrong. Well, you can obviously begin to see how this perception or this idea kind of can lead to really, really dangerous and even even tragic results, right? When you leave the masses, right, the majority to decide on the minority, right? And so this was Jeremy Bentham. And then after Bentham, you had the great John Stuart Mill. And Mill, like Bentham, was also a utilitarianist, okay? Or he also promoted the idea that utility was the driver for economic activity and economic decisions. The difference between Mill and Bentham was that Mill believed in certain activities, certain things being more important, okay, or some ideas of happiness being better than others. So he incorporated kind of a sense of that there were some things that were more important, or that there were some things that should not be completely allowed to take place. Okay, for example, he favored some government regulation and taxation because he believed that you couldn't just have everything deregulated, because human beings would abuse those quote-unquote rights, right? Whereas Bentham believed that there were no natural rights and people should be able to do whatever maximized their utility. Well, you can begin to see that if you follow Bentham's logic of utility maximization at any cost, you quickly can fall into activities and things that are perhaps not going to be moral, or in our worldview, not Christian, right? Mill, on the other hand, believed that we needed to have some rules, we needed to have some boundaries, and that certain things were more important in society and for society than others, and that we should also limit one's maximization of utility limited by another person's maximization of utility. So it shouldn't just be everything goes. We should be restricted and constrained by another person's or society's utility functions as well. Okay, so these are the classics, okay, classical economists. The other major school of economics that we study is the Keynesian approach. Okay, so the classical approach and then the Keynesian approach. Of course, the Keynesian approach comes about through the works of the great economist John Maynard Keynes. And Keynes is considered still one of the greatest economists of all time. In fact, if you think about the top 3 or 4 in the history of economics, you're probably going to have Keynes in there. Okay, he's no doubt about it. He's one of the elder statesmen of economic theory, and the reason for it is because he comes about in the early to middle 20th century, and he begins to address some of the concerns of our century, as opposed to these other individuals, the classics, who were addressing the issues of the 19th century. Keynes began to address some of the issues of the 20th century, and he began to see that while the ideas of the classics were sound and important and in many ways were true, they did not explain economic phenomena and market failures in some ways, if you want to call them that, or even just simply the way that markets functioned. That the classics did not explain all phenomena. And in particular, what Keynes brought about was the idea that the economy could not simply self-adjust and self-regulate and fix itself as the classics suggested that it could. Okay, because he believed that there were periods of expansion and periods of contraction in the economy, and in the periods of contraction where the economy shrunk, say GDP shrunk, right, and say in a recession, you needed to incorporate monetary policy to stimulate economic activity. In a contractionary period, when the economy contracts, mainly one of the things that you can do to stimulate economic activity is to lower interest rates, right, and to increase the money supply to get the cost of borrowing, the cost of money lower, so that people have a desire to borrow money, to consume money, to spend money, and by having the lower interest rates, it creates an incentive for people to consume instead of to save. On the other hand, Keynes believed that in periods of expansion, that there might be too much growth and too much expansion, and that would lead to inflation and the economy overheating, so to speak. And so for those periods, Keynes believed that you should use monetary policy to keep the economy from overheating. So perhaps increase the interest rate to reduce spending, promote savings, right? That would create downward pressure on prices and keep inflation at bay. So he believed that government had a role. He believed that government had a role in maintaining economic stability and keeping the economy from either being stagnant and shrinking to a point of recession and even depression, because he did live through the Great Depression, but also that the government had a role to stimulate the economy when it needed to by using sound monetary policy, something that the United States government, for example, did not do during the Great Recession, the Great Depression, I should say. He also had his very famous phrase, in the long term or in the long run, we're all dead, right? The short versus long-term effects, because in economics, we often use the term, that's not good in the long run, or that doesn't work in the long run, or in the long run, we are going to see demand rebound. Well, he believed that we could not wait until the long run, because if you waited for the economy to fix itself, it may never fix itself. And that's exactly what happened with the Great Depression. The U.S. government did not incorporate a sound and aggressive monetary policy to stimulate growth, output, borrowing, saving, and give the consumers and the banking system and the firms that confidence that was necessary to get the U.S. economy out of that depression. So that's the great John Maynard Keynes. Okay, so some key concepts that I want you to keep track of in Chapter 1 or from Chapter 1, okay? Very important. What is demand, okay? Make sure that you understand the difference between demand and quantity demanded, okay? Because the law of demand says that as you increase prices, quantity demanded goes down. As prices decrease, quantity demanded goes up, That's the law of demand. But then there are these determinants of demand also. And determinants of demand are all those things except for price. So preferences, expectations, prices of other goods, okay? These are the determinants of demand. So please keep in mind, keep an eye on the difference between the quantity demanded and demand itself, okay? The same with supply. What is supply? Well, supply is what people, producers, right, supply goods and services for the economy. The same thing with the law of supply. The law of supply says that as prices in the economy increase, suppliers are going to increase their supply. And as the prices of a product decrease in the market, suppliers are going to supply less. So there's a relationship between price and quantity supplied. But there are these other determinants of supply that also have an impact on supply, like, for example, expectations of the future, okay? And technology, the cost of production also. If, for example, all of a sudden here comes this new technology that reduces production costs by 25%, you can expect supply to be able to increase, okay? So for this chapter, keep in mind the difference between demand and quantity demanded, and the difference between supply and quantity supplied. All right, so that's the material for this week. Now, for your assignments for this week, remember we said we had an assignment, we have a journal entry, and then we have the quiz, right? So those are the 3 deliverables for this week, and you also have to think about the topic that you're going to be using, the author that you're going to be using and talking about for your critical assignment in week 8. So how to get an A, all right? I know that students, this is a really big concern. So I'm going to give you the secret here, okay? How to get an A in assignment 1. Well, make sure that you address both parts of the assignment, okay? The assignment has 2 parts. You are to discuss and compare the economic theories of Adam Smith and John Maynard Keynes. So Adam Smith and Keynes. And then, so that's the first part. And then the second part is discuss the roles of producers and consumers in a capitalist economy as they relate to Christian values. All right, so this is a really nice and interesting question for this assignment. I recommend that the article by McClelland as a starting point to give you some idea of how to answer this question. All right. Please remember to quote directly from the readings and citing authors and page number, okay? Use APA 7. Correct citing is very important, all right? Make sure that you meet the minimum required of quoted material in the responses to the prompts, okay? However many sources are required, make sure that you have that number of sources, right? And of course, if the assignment asks for 4 sources and you give me 4 sources, that's meeting the requirement. But if you give me 5 or 6 or 7 sources, that's exceeding the requirement, okay? So keep that in mind. Use proper APA. Make sure, please, to check your assignment for clarity, grammar, and spelling before you submit. This is an easy way to lose points. And sometimes you have misspelled words or punctuation errors. And then, of course, sometimes you also have these run-on sentences or awkward-sounding sentences in a paper that may not make too much sense. And that's important that you review them before you turn in your paper. Okay, so please do that. And then last but not least, remember that your answers and discussion should be about 2 to 3 pages, must be typed and submitted in a Word document file. Word document file, please, okay? So that I can make comments on your paper. All right, so that's how you get an A in this assignment. Now, as far as the journal entry, the expectations for the journal entry. So Here, make sure that you address these questions. Remember first that there is a 100 word minimum. I've never liked word minimums or maximums, never. But we have to follow the rubric, and there's a reason for the 100 word minimum, right? Also, but just, it's a 100 word minimum. Don't write 500 words, right? Something around 150, or meet the minimum, but don't go overboard. Okay. All right. So answer these questions. What do I already know about political economy that can help me in this course? So answer that question. Is the study of political economy important to me? Why or why not? How much time will I allocate to this course every week? And how will I spend that time? What do I most want to learn from this course? These are important questions, right? And that will help you and me kind of frame ideas and concepts throughout the course, throughout the 8 weeks, so that they make most sense to you and are most beneficial. And then last but not least, don't forget to submit the name of the theorist that you have chosen for your critical assignment. Alrighty? Okay, so that is the journal entry. All right. And last but not least, okay, in closing, I always like to close with a little bit giving us a little bit of a perspective on how the material for the week kind of fits with our Christian values or Christian perspective. And so what does it mean to have a Christian perspective in economics? Or where do we find Christianity in economics? Well, if we think about things like work and rest, okay? We have Sunday is the Lord's Day, and that's the day that we rest, right? In economics, we always talk about work and leisure. We always talk about there is a substitution effect, and we'll talk about that maybe during the class, about how we individuals will decide how much to work and how much to rest based on, say, the price of labor, wages, right? If all of a sudden somebody's willing to pay you $100 an hour or $200 an hour, you're going to have an incentive to work more, right? But if wages are $10 an hour, then the incentive is not so much there to work, and perhaps there's more incentive to rest. Here we also take into consideration the value of time, love and human worth, for example. How much do we value time with our families, with our husbands and wives, and with our children? How much do we value time for prayer, time for reflection, right? So there's that substitution effect, and that having to decide on work, leisure, prayer, family time. So all of this is kind of embedded in the Christian perspective in economics. Cooperation, right? Cooperation is a concept that's also covered in economics, because cooperation is found in markets. Markets are, in essence, people cooperating. They are operating co-optively, right? Or they're co-opting. They're cooperating. Buyers, sellers, producers, right? Of course, productivity, right? We want to be productive. Everything comes from God. And God has given us bountiful things in nature and resources and our gifts, intelligence and creativity, so that we can maximize our potential. Well, that maximizing potential is all about being productive, and productivity is a driver of economic activity. And of course, there's ownership, right? We own the means of production, but we also own our ideas, our thoughts, our dreams, our expectations. So ownership is an important concept in economics as well. And then lastly, celebration and redistribution, right? We celebrate through obtaining things like, for example, a home, Okay, we purchase a home. Well, that's a blessing. It's a blessing from God, and we celebrate it because it provides our family with a roof over our heads. It provides them with a place for us to be together, to grow, to care for each other, to find new opportunities for employment and for school, right? And so we celebrate these material acquisitions, not for the material part of it themselves, but rather what they represent and how they're going to help us and how they're going to fill our lives with hope, with security, and these are all good things, right? And of course, redistribution of income is something that is very much at the center of Christianity, right? Christ wants us to be empathetic with our fellow man, to give to those who are in need, to those who have less. To if we have more, if we have an extra clothing, or we can give for a shelter, or we can donate or volunteer our time. That's redistribution. That's redistributing our goods, our services, our time. And redistribution is a concept in economics that is widely studied. We also see it when we talk about taxation, because taxation is the mechanism by which we redistribute wealth in the economy. So, as you can see, there are so many ways that we can, or so many things that we find in economics that align with Christ and with a Christian perspective. And so, I hope that that these ideas are interesting, and I welcome you also to share your ideas and how you think your Christian worldview, your perspective, and fits into economics, or how economics fits into your Christian worldview. Okay? Thank you very much for taking the time to listen to me. I know that this first lecture has been a little long, but I'll try and keep them short. Okay? God bless you all, and have fun during week 1. Thank you.